I'd been a pipe fitter for 19 years. I know how to read pressure gauges, how to tell when a joint's about to blow before it blows, how to stay calm when something's wrong underground and panic would get you killed. I'm good at reading situations. I thought I was good at reading people too. I was wrong about that last part, and it cost my son 8 weeks of his life that I'll never be able to give back to him. His name is Eli. He was 12 when this happened. He's 14 now and he still sleeps with the light on, not a nightlight, the actual overhead light, full brightness. I bought blackout curtains for his room when he was 9 because he said the street light kept him awake. They've been in a box in the garage ever since. I don't ask him about it. We don't need to talk about it. I just make sure the light bill gets paid. My ex-wife and I separated when Eli was 9. It wasn't dramatic. We didn't scream at each other or throw things. We just quietly ran out of whatever it was that had held us together. And one morning, I drove to my brother's place with 2 duffel bags, and that was that. She kept the house. I got an apartment 20 minutes away. We split custody down the middle. Week on, week off. Eli seemed okay. Kids adapt, that's what everyone told me, and for a while I believed it. The trouble started the summer he turned 12. He'd been struggling in school. Not failing, but not present either. His teacher sent home a note in April that said he seemed disengaged. His mom, her name is Vicky, she'd been reading about these outdoor education programs, therapy through nature, structured environments for kids going through transitions. She showed me a brochure in May, across the hood of her car in the parking lot of his school. The place was called Ridgecrest Youth Leadership Academy, based in eastern Tennessee. The brochure had pictures of kids, hiking, building campfires, sitting in circles talking to counselors. It looked like a summer camp. It was described as a summer camp. 8 weeks. Focus on resilience, responsibility, leadership development. The price was $47,200. I remember that number exactly. I wrote the check myself. I read the brochure twice. I asked 2 questions. Was it accredited and was there a phone policy? Vicky said yes to the first one and explained that the second few weeks were a digital detox period, limited contact to help kids adjust. I thought that was reasonable. I thought a lot of things were reasonable that I should have questioned harder. We dropped Eli off on a Saturday in late June. The intake coordinator was a woman named Sandra who had a warm smile and a clipboard and used words like growth journey and intentional community. Eli had his backpack. He turned around at the door of the main building and looked at me, and I gave him a thumbs up like an idiot. He didn't smile back. He just turned and walked inside. I drove 3 hours home and went back to work the following Monday. My job takes me out of state. I work for a pipeline contractor and we follow the projects. Wherever there's a contract, that's where we go. I've been on a job outside of Knoxville. Ironically, not that far from where Eli was, but I finished that project in July and got assigned to one outside of Pittsburgh in August. 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The kind of work schedule that fills your head so completely there isn't much room for anything else. Vicky sent me updates. Everything's fine, he's adjusting. They said he had a rough first week, but that's normal. I took her word for it because I didn't have reason not to. We weren't enemies. We were just 2 people who used to be married and were now trying to co-parent without making things worse than they already were. I got one letter from Eli. It came in late July, handwritten on lined paper with a Ridgecrest letterhead at the top. It said, "Dad, I am okay. The food is different here. I hope work is good. I miss home." His handwriting was careful. Too careful. Like he'd been told what to write and was trying to get every letter right. I read it probably 10 times. I told myself I was reading too much into it. 12-year-old boys don't write elaborate letters. It was fine. It wasn't fine. The Pittsburgh job wrapped up 11 days early. Equipment delays on the other end. Stuff outside our control. My foreman sent us home on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. I had a week before the next project started. I drove to my apartment, threw my gear in the corner, and sat on the couch for about 20 minutes before I decided I was going to Tennessee. I didn't call ahead. I told myself it was because I wanted to surprise Eli. The truth is something made me not want to call. I've thought about that a lot in the years since. Whatever internal alarm system I'd been ignoring for 2 months finally got loud enough to hear. I left at 4 in the morning. 7 hours south, cup of gas station coffee in the holder, radio off. Just the road and the dark. Ridgecrest was up a county road past a town called Hartwell, a real town, a hardware store and a diner and a post office, the kind of place where people know their neighbors. Past Hartwell you turned left at a rusted gate and followed a gravel road up into the ridge. The website had pictures of the same gate with flowers planted on either side. When I got there in the early morning it was just a gate, no flowers. One of the wooden posts had been patched with aluminum flashing and duct tape. I parked and walked toward the main building. The sun wasn't fully up yet. There was mist in the tree line, and I heard it before I saw anything. A rhythmic sound, hard and repetitive, coming from the north side of the property. I followed it. There were 6 boys, all of them somewhere between 11 and 14, I guess. They were in a cleared area at the edge of the woods, stacking split wood. Not stacking, hauling. Carrying armloads of cut logs from a pile near a shed and stacking them against a long timber rack about 30 yards away. A man I didn't recognize was sitting on a camp chair at the far end of the clearing with a travel mug, watching them. Eli was the 3rd boy in line. He was wearing a gray shirt that was too big for him, and work pants I'd never seen before. His arms were thin. Not summer camp thin, the kind of thin that happens when someone isn't eating enough. His hair had grown out, and it was stuck to the side of his face, with sweat. It was 5:47 in the morning. I checked my phone. I needed to be sure of that number because I knew what I was going to need to say later. I called his name. He dropped the logs he was carrying. Just let them fall. He turned around and he looked at me, and his face did something I don't have the right words for. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like disbelief. Like he'd stopped expecting me to come and hadn't finished deciding how to feel about that. I crossed the clearing. I didn't look at the man with the travel mug. I got to Eli and I put my hands on his shoulders and I looked at him, and the first thing I said was, "When did you eat last?" He said, "Yesterday at dinner. It was almost 6 in the morning." I said, "What time was dinner?" He said, 4:30. I pulled him toward me and held on, and I felt how his shoulder blades moved under my hands, and I had to breathe through my nose for a second to keep it together. The man with the travel mug was walking toward us. He was maybe 50, sunburned, work shirt with the Ridgecrest logo on the breast pocket. He said, "Sir, visiting hours don't start until..." I said, "I'm not visiting. I'm taking my son home." He said his name was Doug, and he was the morning supervisor, and I needed to speak with the program director before I could remove a student from the property. I said I didn't need to speak with anyone. He said it was in the enrollment contract. I said I'd signed an enrollment contract, not a custody agreement, and I'd like to see the legal text that prevented a biological parent from removing their minor child from a private facility. Doug did not have a good answer for that. He radioed someone. A few minutes later, a man came down from the main building. This was the program director. His name was Arthur Pell. He was probably 60, trim, wearing khakis and a fleece vest, despite the August heat, and he had the practiced calm of someone who'd had this conversation before. He shook my hand. He smiled. He said he understood I was concerned, but that Eli was making real progress, and that pulling him before the program concluded could undo the work of the entire 8 weeks. I said he's been hauling firewood since before 6 in the morning without breakfast. Arthur Pell said the morning work program was an integral part of the curriculum. Physical labor built character. Boys in the program rose at 5:15 and completed a work rotation before breakfast at 7. I said, "And what do you do with the firewood?" He paused for just a second too long. He said it was used to heat the facility in colder months. I said, "You're storing firewood in August for winter, with 12-year-old boys, before feeding them breakfast." He said the program had been operating for 11 years, and they'd had excellent outcomes. I looked at Eli and I said, "Go get your things." Arthur Pell said, "I'm going to have to ask you to." I said, "You're going to have to do a lot more than ask." Eli went to get his things. I stood in that clearing and looked at Doug and Arthur Pell, and I didn't say anything else because I didn't need to. Arthur Pell made a phone call. I assumed he was calling a lawyer. Later, I found out he called the county sheriff's department to report a disturbance on private property. He had done this before. That was the part that kept me up for months afterward. He'd done it before, and it had worked before, meaning someone had backed down and left their kid there, and I don't know who that family was, but I think about them. Eli came back with his backpack. It was lighter than when we dropped him off. I asked him about that later. He said some of his things had been confiscated during the first week because they were distractions. That included a small photo album his grandmother had made him with pictures of our family. A photo album. We were walking toward my truck when Eli stopped. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "There's a kid in the equipment shed. His name is Ryan. He's been in there since yesterday afternoon." I stopped walking. I said, "What do you mean in there?" Eli said, "He argued with Doug at lunch and they put him in the shed. They call it the reflection room. It locks from the outside." I stood there for a second. The shed was maybe 40 yards behind us, back toward the woodpile. It was a gray metal building with a sliding door and a padlock through the handle. I told Eli to get in my truck. I gave him my keys. I said, "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me." Then I walked back to the shed. Arthur Pell was still near the main building on his phone. Doug was still in the clearing. I walked past both of them. Doug said, "Sir," and I said, "Don't." The padlock wasn't a serious one. It was a hardware store combination lock, the kind that costs $8. I don't know what I would have done if it had been something harder to deal with. I'd like to say I would have found a way regardless. I had a pry bar in my truck, but Eli had my keys. There was a rubber doorstop wedged under the door. I kicked it loose and pushed the door open. The shed smelled like motor oil and heat. There was a riding mower, a rack of tools on the wall, a 5-gallon bucket in the corner with a lid on it that I understood immediately, and that made my stomach drop. The boy was sitting against the far wall. He'd made himself small, back against the corrugated metal, knees pulled up. He looked up when the light came in and flinched, actually flinched. The way you do when you've been in the dark long enough that brightness hurts. His name was Ryan Kowalski. He was 13. He was from Chattanooga. He told me this in the parking lot while we were waiting for the county sheriff to arrive, sitting on the tailgate of my truck with a water bottle I'd found in my cab, and his voice was flat in a way that worried me. Not calm. Flat. The way people get when they've been scared for long enough that they've used up the part of themselves that feels scared. I'd called 911 before I opened the lock. I want to be clear about that. I called before I touched anything. I described what I'd been told and what I was about to do, and I stayed on the line. 2 deputies arrived within 20 minutes. One of them was a young woman who took one look at the shed and at Ryan and got on her radio immediately. Arthur Pell tried to explain the reflection room policy to the deputies. One of the deputies asked him to stop talking. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services arrived within 2 hours. By noon, there were 3 agency vehicles on the property, 2 additional sheriff's cars, and a woman from the district attorney's office who drove up from the county seat. I sat with Eli in my truck. He had his seat reclined and his arm over his eyes, and after about an hour, he fell asleep. He slept for almost 3 hours in that parking lot while everything happened around him. I ate a gas station sandwich from my cooler and watched the main building and called Vicky and had the hardest conversation of my life. She didn't know. I want to say that clearly because it matters. She had called the facility 3 times during the 8 weeks and been told Eli was doing well. She had been told the same thing she'd been told at intake. She'd asked about the limited contact policy and been given the same reassuring language about program integrity and adjustment periods. She trusted it because the brochure was professional and the intake coordinator was warm, and $4,200 felt like real money. Like real money meant real accountability. It doesn't work that way. I didn't know that either before this. She drove to Tennessee, got there around 4 in the afternoon. She sat in the truck with Eli while I talked to a caseworker named Teresa, who had a notepad and a tired face and asked me the same questions 3 times in slightly different ways. I understood why. I answered all of them. There were 9 boys at the facility when the state arrived. All of them were interviewed. All of them were released to their families within 48 hours. The facility was closed pending investigation. Arthur Pell and Doug, his full name was Douglas Crane, were both charged. The charges included unlawful restraint of a minor, child endangerment, operating a youth residential program without a state license, and a handful of other things I learned from the DA's press release 3 months later. I'll tell you what Ridgecrest Youth Leadership Academy actually was. It was 2 men with a piece of land, a website, a brochure they'd had printed at a FedEx office, and a scheme. They charged families between $3,500 and $5,000 per child for an 8-week program. 9 boys that summer. Do the math. The firewood Eli and the others had been cutting and stacking since mid-July was being sold to a landscaping company in Hartwell. There was a receipt in Arthur Pell's office. The boys were labor. That's what they were. That's what they were. That's what the whole thing was. The accreditation Vicky had been told about was a membership in a private trade association. Not a government body, not a licensed certifying organization, just a dues-paying membership in a group that had a logo and sounded official. 20 minutes of research would have shown that. Neither of us did 20 minutes of research. We trusted the brochure. Arthur Pell was convicted 17 months later. Sentenced to 11 years. Douglas Crane took a plea and got 4 with the possibility of parole. I sat in the courtroom for the sentencing. I brought Eli. He asked we could come, and I thought about it and said yes. He sat next to me and watched, and when the judge read the sentence, he didn't react. He just nodded, like something had been confirmed that he'd already decided to believe. On the drive home, he said, "Is it okay if we stop? I want a milkshake." I said yes. We stopped at a Dairy Queen outside of Knoxville, and he got a large chocolate shake, and I got a cup of coffee, and we sat in the booth by the window for about an hour without talking much, and that was one of the best hours I've had in a long time. He's in 8th grade now. He plays bass guitar badly and enthusiastically, which is exactly the right way to play bass guitar at 14. He has 2 good friends who come over on weekends and eat everything in my refrigerator. He still sleeps with the light on, and I still don't ask about it. I've thought about what I'd say to other parents, because people ask me. People in the comments ask. People I know ask, "What's the lesson? What do you do differently?" Here's what I'd tell them. If a program limits contact with your child during the first several weeks and calls it an adjustment period, ask to see the specific policy in writing and ask what happens if your child needs to reach you. If they can't answer that clearly, leave. Visit the facility before you sign anything. Don't call ahead. Show up. See what you see. Ask who regulates them, not who they're a member of. Who regulates them? What government body has oversight? If the answer involves a private association with a logo, that's not regulation. Ask for references and actually call them. Not email, call. Ask if they'd send their child back, and if your gut says something is wrong, it probably is. I ignored mine for 2 months because I was busy and because ignoring it was easier than what it would take to act on it. My son was 12 years old and he was loading firewood at 5:47 in the morning, and I was in Pittsburgh reading a text that said he's adjusting. Eli was the one who told me about Ryan. He knew there was a kid in that shed. He'd known since the afternoon before. He'd been awake all night, he told me later, trying to decide if he could trust that I would actually come. He decided I would. I don't know how to explain what that did to me. I don't know how to explain the weight of being the thing your kid holds on to when everything else has turned out to be something other than what it said it was. It's not a comfortable weight. It doesn't feel like pride. It feels more like a debt, the kind you don't pay off, you just carry, and you make sure every day that you're worth it. I paid $4,200 to send my son to a labor camp. I drove 7 hours on a Wednesday because something in me finally stopped being quiet. I broke a padlock off a shed door and found a 13-year-old boy sitting in the dark next to a bucket. None of that is the thing I'm most proud of in this story. The thing I'm most proud of is that Eli trusted me to come. Be the parent they trust to come. Do the research, make the calls, show up unannounced, read the contract. And when your kid writes you a letter that feels careful in a way you can't quite name, read it again. Then get in the car. I've turned this over in my head more times than I can count. Not the drive, not the padlock, not Arthur Pell's face when I told him I was taking my son home. Those parts are clear. What I keep turning over is the 2 months before any of that. The part where I was in Pittsburgh reading a text that said he's adjusting and deciding that was enough. There's a version of this story where I never go, where the job runs its full schedule, where I trust the updates, where Eli finishes the 8 weeks and comes home quiet and different in ways I tell myself are just part of growing up. That version exists. It nearly happened. And the only thing that stopped it was that a job got done 11 days early, and I sat on my couch for 20 minutes and listened to something I'd been talking myself out of for 2 months. I don't think that's luck. I think that's what happens when you stop explaining away what you know. Arthur Pell built something that worked because parents like me made it work. We paid the money, we read the brochure, we accepted limited contact because the language around it was calm and professional. We trusted the logo. Every single thing he needed to keep that operation running we handed to him voluntarily, because we were busy, because it was easier, because questioning it meant admitting we hadn't done enough due diligence before we signed. That's the part nobody wants to sit with, not the predator. The predator is easy. You hate him, you want him in prison, and eventually he goes. The harder part is understanding how much of what happened was made possible by the space we left for it, by the research we didn't do, by the visit we didn't make, by the letter our kid wrote carefully on lined paper that we read once and put down. Eli knew something was wrong from the first week. He's 12 years old, and he knew. He just didn't know if telling me would matter. That's not a failure of instinct on his part. That's a conclusion he'd started to reach based on evidence, on not hearing from me, on being told I'd signed off on his being there, on 8 weeks of nobody coming. Kids don't stop trusting you all at once. They do it gradually, the way water wears down stone, one unanswered question at a time. The thing about Ryan, the boy in that shed, is that nobody came for him that day. I came for Eli and I found Ryan. His parents didn't know he was there because they were trusting the same updates, reading the same language, accepting the same silence. They were doing what Vicky and I had done. There is no clean way to be okay with that. What I know now is this: intelligence isn't just what you know, it's what you're willing to find out even when finding out is inconvenient. Showing up unannounced is inconvenient. Calling references is inconvenient. Reading the regulatory fine print is inconvenient. All of it takes time you think you don't have. But those things are not optional. They are the job. The actual job. The one that doesn't end when you leave the worksite. Eli plays bass guitar now. Badly and with complete commitment, which is the only way worth playing anything at 14. He's okay. Not untouched. I don't think untouched was ever going to be available to him or to any kid who goes through something like that. But he's okay in the ways that matter. He moves through the world. He trusts people. He trusted me. That trust was not free. He extended it under conditions that made it completely reasonable for him not to. That's not something I take lightly. That's something I carry. Carry yours.